Welcome to the Oral History Podcast, which features stories from the oral history website voicesofoklahoma.com, where Oklahomans have given generously of their time to tell their life story for present-day listeners and for the generations to come. Our entire collection is available at voicesofoklahoma.com. By subscribing to our podcast, you will be notified of new Oklahoma oral history podcasts. So now listen to another interesting storyteller from voicesofoklahoma.com.
Judge Stephanie Kulp Seymour, who joined a historic class of women judges when she was appointed in 1979 to the Tenth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, was encouraged early on by her parents to be an independent thinker. While a youngster, she and her sister received the same encouragement as their two brothers. Seymour attended integrated public schools in Battle Creek, Michigan, but was homeschooled during long family trips around the country and overseas. Seymour had hoped to attend Harvard or Yale, but those Ivy League colleges did not accept women as undergraduates in the 1950s. Seymour believes now that Smith College, an all-women's school in western Massachusetts, better prepared her to compete among men after her graduation. She graduated Harvard Law in 1965 when a recruiter told her he had no interest in hiring women. She later became his firm's first female lawyer. When she moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1966, the city had only 5 practicing women lawyers. Upon her appointment to the Tenth Circuit U.S. Appeals Court in 1979, Judge Seymour became its first female judge, and later its first female chief judge. She assumed senior status in 2005. Now you can listen to Judge Stephanie Seymour tell her story on the oral history website, voicesofoklahoma.com.
My name is John Erling. Today's date is December 5th, 2019. Stephanie, would you state your full name, please?
Stephanie Kulp Seymour.
I've got to ask you about Kulp. Where does that come from?
That's my maiden name.
Your maiden name's Kulp.
Kulp.
So did you have a middle name at birth?
I did. It was Irene, and I hated it, so I ditched it. But...
And now it's here for the record. You don't like me already. What is your date of birth?
October 16, 1940.
What is your present age?
79.
Where are we recording this interview?
Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the federal courthouse.
And at the beginning, let me state that you are senior judge for the U.S. Court of Appeals for 10th Circuit. You assumed this status in 2005.
Yes.
You're chief judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit from 1994 through 2000.
Yes.
And you were appointed by President Jimmy Carter November of 79, and you served to 2005.
Correct.
Nice way to begin. So, let's go to the beginning. Where were you born?
Battle Creek, Michigan.
And that's where you grew up?
That's where I grew up.
Your mother's name and her personality and what she was like.
My mother's name was Frances Bria Kulp, and I'm telling you Bria because she's Italian. Her parents, my grandparents, came to the U.S., I think about 1898, and lived in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a place called Bessemer. She came to Battle Creek to go to nursing school at the hospital there. And she was a nursing when she met my dad.
Was that a career for her, or did she raise?
She quit. I don't remember her working.
Your father's name?
Francis, spelled with an I-S. Hers is an E-S, Francis Bruce Kulp. And he went by Bruce.
His personality?
My dad was a very interesting guy, kind of laid back, extremely smart and well-read. But he broke his leg ice skating when he was in the 9th grade. And when he was recovering, he got polio. So he never went back to school. He was in a brace for the rest of his life.
And what did he do?
Well, he was a goof-off for a while. During the war, he drove around the country with a friend to military bases, and they hired people to put on entertainment at military bases. That's what he did. And then when he came back to Battle Creek, when we married my mother, he started a contracting business, building houses. He hired people to build houses for people returning from the war. He actually went early on.
So the personalities of your mother and father, do you draw on either one of them, or are you completely different?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I guess I'm a mix. I was a shy kid. I think my father maybe tended to be that way. But having had 4 children, I think you get your personality when you're born, and that's it.
You went on to extensive education. Were they promoters of education?
My mother was a promoter of me going to Michigan State and majoring in home economics, because that's what women did back then. My father was a promoter of me going to the best school I could possibly get into. He was very big on education. He wanted me to go to the Ivy League. Turns out the Ivy League, the men's colleges at that time, were men's colleges, and they didn't accept women when I went to college.
That would have been in the 50s?
I graduated from high school in 58, so yes. That's how I focused on the women's colleges.
But you knew, as you were growing up, you were going to college.
Oh, absolutely.
You were destined.
Yeah, in my family, there was no question about that.
Yeah. Brothers or sisters?
I have a brother who's a year and a half older. I have a brother who's 3 years younger. And I have a sister who's 5 years younger.
And they went on to college as well.
Yes.
What was the first house you remember? Where was it?
I can picture it in my mind. My father built it, had it built. It was brick. It was in Battle Creek. I don't remember the street. We had this part of the house, and it had a separate part with apartments that he rented out. First floor and top floor. Had a big backyard. And then subsequently, he, in the big backyard, built apartment buildings, had apartment buildings built.
Overall, he must have done fairly well, didn't he?
He did very well.
In contracting.
He did.
As a child with your family, what would you do for entertainment?
Go to movies with my dad. My mother didn't go because she wanted to stay home and have some peace by herself. We often went to movies on the weekend. My dad loved movies. We traveled a lot. His business was in the summertime, and it was quite cold in Michigan in the winter. So we would take off in the winter and go all over the country. We went to Florida a lot, St. Petersburg, starting when I was in kindergarten, because I remember going to kindergarten. They put us in school there temporarily, and we stayed there for a while. And after we got a little bit older, we started traveling the country. We did Route 66 all the way to California once. And I say a word I didn't know back then, that I was homeschooled in a car during those periods, like 3 months every winter. My mother would get the books. We would take them along, and she'd make us do the work and the homework.
All 4 children?
4 children, yeah.
And what were you traveling in?
Oh, I don't know. My father loved cars, so all kinds of
Must have been a van.
No, they didn't have vans back
No,
then.
they didn't.
They just had big cars.
Yeah. But as you look back on that, that was a terrific learning experience for you.
It was fabulous, yes. By the time I was in 7th grade, I'd been in every state by car but 3.
You had a major advantage over somebody else who had never left Michigan.
Yes. And then when I was in 7th grade, I had to stay home. He and my mother still traveled, took the younger kids for a while. My older brother and I stayed home with my great aunt Grace. And then eventually, no more traveling during school years.
Growing up in Michigan and then traveling to other parts of the country like the South, you saw things in the South that you never saw in Michigan.
You got that right, like chain gangs beside the road and no blacks allowed on signs all over the place. I mean, it was incredible because Battle Creek was a very integrated place, and I went to integrated schools my whole life. So it was pretty shocking. My father and mother both were very outspoken against the discrimination that was going on.
Do you remember traveling to Oklahoma for the first time?
Not really, but obviously we came through here. I don't know if we stayed.
In the 50s, you remember talk of the fear of communism, and schools would have nuclear fallout drills. Do you remember that?
I don't remember nuclear fallout drills, but I know a lot of talk about communism.
And the fear that they were going to take over the United States.
Yeah.
Remember the first president you may have heard on the radio or paid attention to?
Truman, because he came through on a train, came through Battle Creek and stopped.
He was campaigning, maybe?
Yeah, campaigning. That was before he was president.
The first school you attended, what was that?
I attended public schools in Battle Creek, walked to school. It was a totally different atmosphere than now. It was perfectly safe to go anywhere. I went to public schools all the way through high school.
Junior high school, of course, right there. And then high school?
There was one high school. That was where I had most of my experience with integration because we were totally integrated because there's only one public high school. I was actually a cheerleader on a cheerleading team. There were 4 of us, one of whom was black girl. And of course, we were rooting for very integrated teams. And we had integrated school dances.
So the idea of segregated schools was just beyond.
Shocking.
Yeah. What were your interests in high school?
Oh, I loved learning. Took piano lessons. Took swimming lessons. There were no girls' sports. I did, except diving. I did diving. There was a swim team.
You graduate high school in
58.
By that time, you had already chosen a college?
Yes, because we went to look at the women's colleges. Early that year, I guess, or the summer before, I can't remember. It must have been during the school year. I looked at Wellesley and Radcliffe and Smith.
Did it bother you at that time?
That I couldn't get into Harvard or Yale?
Yeah.
Not like it does now. Right. It was just the way it was.
The way it was, right. Your experience at Smith College, all-female school, was there an adjustment from Battle Creek?
Yes.
And Smith College in Massachusetts?
It's in western Massachusetts.
Was there a big adjustment there for you?
Yes, the first year, because a lot of the girls there had gone to private schools on the East Coast and had more education than I did. So the first year I sort of struggled in some of the classes, but I think by the end of the first year I was perfectly comfortable competing with kids from anywhere. And actually my Smith education turned out to be one of the best things for me because, as I said, I was a shy kid. We didn't have guys in class, so you didn't have to wear makeup and you didn't have to worry about that. Didn't date during the week. And I learned that I could compete against smart girls, so I gained a lot of confidence there.
Some of these families that you could sense were very, very wealthy, maybe? Did that play into any of that?
No, because everybody was sort of laid back. I mean, we were going into the 60s and we weren't dating. It's not like we were competing for anything. We came from all over, so I had really no sense of who came from.
Right. Was there a sense amongst the girls attending Smith that we're just as smart as the guys at Harvard and Yale, and you kind of had that chip on your shoulder, maybe?
Oh, well, I didn't look at it as a chip.
No.
I looked at it as finding out that, yes, we were as smart. That was a good thing.
Yeah. And that was back then. We
Yes.
don't have to do that today.
No.
Because we now know that women are smarter than men.
Right.
Right.
And as I say, when women run the world, we aren't going to have any wars.
Right. At Smith, was there a particular class or teacher that
Inspired me.
into law?
Mm-hmm.
Would that have been the first time you were inspired to be in law? Tell us about that.
I was a political science major. I was interested in government. I took a course my junior year, a political science course on the Constitution. So it was basically learning about the Constitution in a government class. I found my teacher very inspiring. It was a man. I don't remember his name. I can sort of picture him. But that's when I decided I wanted to go to law school. And my thought was that I would go to law school and go to work in Washington. That was my plan. First, I had to get in.
You had never thought about law prior to that,
Mm-hmm.
and that shows how a class or a professor can change the course of anybody's life. You were pretty smart. You graduated Phi Beta Kappa, magna cum laude of your class, so that led to your confidence.
Yes. Also helped me get into law school.
Did you continue family travels?
The last big one was the summer after I graduated from high school. We went to Europe. And my dad refused to fly. He didn't like to fly, so we took a ship, drove to New York, parked the car somewhere, and took a large ship. I don't even remember which one it was, to Europe. And then he bought an English Ford, which was not very big, threw the luggage on the top, all the kids in the car, and we traveled around Europe for 3 months.
Wow. Your mother was along on those trips.
Oh, yeah.
What a great bonding experience and learning, and you guys probably still reflect on all those trips.
It was fascinating. I mean, I saw Germany when it was still bombed out in a lot of places. It was really interesting. Not very many people spoke English in Europe back then.
Yeah.
So that's totally changed. But yeah, it was a very interesting experience.
So if you look back on educators in your life, your father was
Yes.
right up there with them.
Mm-hmm.
You applied at which schools then for graduate school?
I applied to Harvard, Yale, and Michigan.
Did you get into all of them?
I did.
Which one did you pick?
I picked Harvard.
Why?
It was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I loved Boston when we visited there. And my older brother was in law school at Michigan, a year ahead of me. So all those reasons.
You didn't want to be where your brother was,
No, I wanted to get out of Michigan.
and you wanted to be the Ivy League person in the family.
Yeah, something like that.
What percentage were women at Harvard when you entered?
I was one of 23 women. I had no idea that Harvard was one of the largest law schools in the country. 580 students in my class. 23 of them were women.
Wow.
And University of Texas Law School are the two biggest. Yeah, wow is right.
Did men wonder, what are you doing here?
I had men ask me, what are you doing here taking the place of a guy? My response was, there's only 23 of me. What are you doing here taking the place of a woman?
So it didn't take them long to find out you were a feisty woman.
Yeah.
And not to put you down. Was that a learning adjustment? You have all these guys, you could be intimidated. Talk to us about how you handled that.
Well, I had experience because being at all women's colleges when we dated, the nearest college was Amherst. It was all men. I dated guys at Amherst and I dated guys at Yale, which were all men. By the time I graduated from Smith, I was fairly confident that I was as good as those guys. So I loved law school. I loved learning the law. I found it very fascinating. I loved the courses.
In the classroom, I'm sure there were those who thought they were very, very smart and outspoken, and you thought, I'm just as smart as you, and I can handle this work. In law school, they have moot court.
Yes.
Tell us what moot court is.
Moot court is a learning process about how to be a lawyer in the real world. And you get a case. It started second semester, our first year, I kind of think. I can't remember, but everybody was on a moot court team. Every first year student, second semester was on a moot court team. I have no idea how they divided us up, but we got cases and we had to write briefs. We got appointed one side or another and you had to write a brief in an actual case. And then somebody on your team had to argue it, but I was not an arguer. I was a brief writer. I think we had 8 people on a team. So it was a process of doing it together with your fellow students. You had one oralist, and then you had an oral argument. I'm sure at first year we were judged by possibly even third year students. I don't know, but some teachers. Then second year, you could do moot court if you wanted to, and not if you didn't want to. But I liked the process. So I did moot court every year. In the third year, our team won the ultimate moot court competition.
You're in competition with
other students. We had so many students at Harvard, they didn't go other places to do moot court. We did our own.
And your strong suit was writing the briefs.
Research and writing.
Tell us how you wanted your name to be listed on the moot court.
Oh, well, it turned out after we won, Harvard Law School puts a plaque in the library for the winning moot court team. Prior to my year, the names was last name and first initial and last name, no first name. I thought nobody will ever know there was a woman on this team. So I went to the dean and I said, how about we start putting first names? And so they did.
So did law come really easy for you?
It did, because I just find it fascinating. I like the research. I like the writing. I like the many different kinds of cases and arguments. It's just fascinating.
I was going to use the word the mechanics of it. Would that be a proper term?
Yeah, I like that too.
Yeah.
Except I basically started as a shy kid, so I would hate to be a district court judge. And I would not be a trial lawyer. I was second chair when I was in practice. And I was writing briefs, but I was not the first person up there making the arguments.
You could have.
Oh, probably.
What were you going to do with this law degree?
My original thought, as I said, was I was going to go to work for the government in Washington, D.C. But I ended up marrying the guy that sat next to me first year in contracts class, who happened to be from Tulsa, Oklahoma. So back then, you went where the guy went. That's how
you came to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Did you get a job here then as a lawyer?
My first job I got because typically the summer after your second year, you work for a firm, try to get your foot in the door wherever you're going. And my husband got us a firm here that had 2 or 3 Harvard lawyers in a small firm. And a lawyer named John Arrington, who'd gone to Harvard Law School, called my husband and offered him a summer job. And my husband said, I already have a summer job, but I have this wife. And that's how I got my first job.
Well, you were fortunate. We interviewed Nancy Feldman and her husband, Ray.
Great.
You know as well as I do how when she came from Chicago, could have worked for the #1 firm. And when she came here, you know the story.
I do.
What happened? Tell us what happened.
She was a good friend. She couldn't get a job. So she ended up teaching. I don't know what she did first, but she ended up teaching.
I like the way she tells it. She said they would say, yeah, we've got a place here. You can be a secretary.
Yeah. That was Justice O'Connor's response when she graduated from Stanford Law School.
Yeah.
And Ruth Ginsburg's. She was here. Her husband was a year ahead of her at law school, and he went in the military. And she was here outside of Norman someplace, wherever the base was.
Lawton?
Probably.
Yeah.
And she couldn't get a job.
As a lawyer.
I think that was after she graduated. Yeah. She worked for the Social Security Administration or something.
Nancy said, one day when I got turned down, I got so mad, I walked to Tulsa University, and there she taught for all those many, many years.
We stayed in Boston for a year, and my then husband went to business school, and then we came here. And when I came here, there were 5 women lawyers in all of Tulsa. I was one of 5. So it was a strange world.
What firm was that you hired with?
Lupardas, Holloman, and Huffman. It was a small firm. John Arrington was there. Jim Kincaid was there. Sam Daniel was there. Fred Doert ended up there. He went into the Navy. He's older than I am, but he went into the Navy and did service. So he graduated from Harvard a year after I did. He ended up there.
Were you well accepted by them?
Yeah.
We have Sam Daniel's interview on Voices of Oklahoma, who passed away this past year.
That was very sad.
How long then did you stay in Tulsa?
Well, I was there after my second year, and then I came back here to work. And then I got pregnant with my first child. And my husband worked for Reading and Bates, offshore drilling company, and got transferred to Houston. So I was just here a couple of years and then moved to Houston.
So was it easy to get a job as a lawyer in Houston?
Well, let me tell you that story. At Harvard Law School, I guess I knew we were going to end up in Houston because I was at Harvard Law School, and this partner from Baker Botts, big law firm in Houston, much bigger now, came to interview my third year. And I guess at that point, there was a question of whether we were going to be in Tulsa for a little bit or go directly to Houston. He spoke to a group, and then you signed up if you wanted an interview. And I went up to talk to him afterwards. This was 1965. I was talking to him. And I said, "Does your firm hire women?" And he thought a minute, and he said, "Yes, but I don't." I said, "Okay, forget about that interview." John Arrington knew that story when I worked for him here. I actually had my first child a month early. I was still working. It was a Monday. I went into the office, and I had baby that night, and I called the next day and said, "Guess what? I'm not coming. I've had a baby born a month early." And then I went to Michigan to see my parents, and then we were going to move to Houston that year. I got a cold call, from a partner at Baker Botts who happened to be a Princeton roommate of John Arrington. As I tell my kids, it's not who you know, it's who you know. John Arrington had called him and told him they should hire me. I'm in Michigan, actually, and I get this cold call from this guy. I got this new baby. He said, "We'd like to interview you." And I said, "Well, I really don't want to work more than 3 days a week." There was this long pause, and he said, "I have them all talked into hiring a woman, but I don't know if they'll hire a part-time lawyer." And I said, "Well, okay, thank you." We moved to Houston in September, and I got a call from him in November. They'd had somebody leave their labor law department, and that was sort of off time of year to hire. So he called me up and asked if I would come in for an interview for a position. I'd had some labor law experience here. So I went in for an interview, and the guy that interviewed me was a managing partner of some kind who could not look me in the eye, honest to God. I sat across from his desk, and he was talking to me this way, sideways, and twirling the cord on the Venetian blinds, asking me questions. He said, "This is going to be a big experiment because we don't know about 3 days a week. And I want you to know this is no permanent offer for anything. This is a 3-day-a-week job." Twiddle, twiddle, twiddle. And he said, "We'll pay you." I don't remember what he said. I had a law school guy I knew that I'd called to find out what he was making. This was second or third year associate by that time. So I said, "I won't work for a penny less than 3/5 of whatever it was." I don't remember what it was. Twiddle, 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 twiddle. He said, "Oh, okay. But we need you to start next week." And I said, "I can't start next week because my parents are coming to visit for 3 weeks over Christmas." This is the end of November. "So how about the 1st of January?" After another twiddles. "Okay." And when I showed up for work at Baker Botts early January, I had just found out I was pregnant again. And I had to decide if I was going to tell them. And I thought, heck with that. He said, "It's a big experiment. It's a big experiment for me, too." So I just went to work. I thought, I'm not going to tell them until I have to. And Empire waistline dresses were handily in. So I didn't tell them until I was about 5 months pregnant. And I remember there's only one partner in the labor law department. It was small. I remember going in to tell him that I was going to be having a baby in August. He burst out laughing. He said, "I can hardly wait to go tell the guy who had interviewed me originally that our lady labor lawyer is going into labor in August, and he went laughing down the hall.
So then how long did you work there?
I stayed off for a year. There was no maternity leave back then. So I just quit. My second child was born in August. They called me almost a year later and wanted me to come back. And I said, 3 days a week? And they said yes. And I said, do I get a raise? And they said yes. So I went back to work. Then my then husband got transferred by Reading Base to Singapore, and I worked at Baker Botts from September to December and moved overseas. That was their first experience with a woman lawyer.
You were the first woman. And some of them said, see?
Yeah, I'm sure they did.
That's what happens when you hire a woman. You talked about children. Let's name them. What are their names?
The first one is named after my first husband, Anderson Bartlett III, and he goes by Bart. The second one is Bria, which is my mother's maiden name, B-R-I-A, Bria. The third one is Sarah, and the fourth one is Anna.
Are any of them in the world of law?
Only one, Sarah.
Singapore. What happens over there?
Very interesting place, Singapore. Vast majority Chinese, minority Malaysian, maybe 3% Indians from India. I got there and had provided by Reading Bates, a house. We had a car with a driver. We had a gardener. We had a cook. And we had a baby ama. I mean, it was great. There weren't any American firms there. So I applied to some British firms. And one of them wanted to hire me because I knew American law, and they thought that would be great. I couldn't get a work permit from the Singaporean government because I was not a Singaporean. That's what they told me. So no work in Singapore.
How long did you live in Singapore?
About a year. I learned duplicate bridge. Took the kids swimming at a club. It was a very interesting experience. One of the interesting parts was to discover that the Malaysians were as discriminated against there as blacks were in the U.S. They were the housekeepers.
Okay. Your children then, you had at that time too?
I had two.
They were so young, they probably don't.
Yeah. I think a little over one and a little over two when we first went there. And then I came back to the U.S. at the end of the first year with the two kids to the U.S. to visit my parents, who were in Florida at the time. I had since found out that my husband, who traveled a lot, was running around on me. So I ended up deciding to file for divorce and stayed here. But I came back to Tulsa. My mother wanted me to come to Battle Creek, and I said, I don't think so. All my legal contacts were here. I knew I could get a job. The firm had split up. Lepardus, Holloman, Huffman, and Sam Daniel and Jim Kincaid were in one place, and Fred Doer was in another. So I knew I could get a job, and I ended up going to work for Derner Saunders, who were the lawyers for Reading Bates. Just happenstance, but I knew them. Sam Daniel was there.
His interview, he talked about how he appreciated the fact that more and more women were in the field and how much it had improved the world. He was very appreciative of that.
Good.
80-some years old.
It took a little educating, but I can remember one time I was in the library getting a book, and it was after hours, like 5:15 or something. There were no secretaries there. I was running around looking for someone to type something up, and he came in and he said, will you type this up for me? And I said, no, type it yourself.
Right. Then you're in Tulsa and working in a law firm. Then something else happens to you.
Well, I ended up remarrying. That came before. Oh, I need to tell you about this too, because this is such an incredible story. I remarried in 1972. Tom Seymour, we've been married now for 47 years, was in that little law firm. That's where I met him, Turner Stewart. Tulsa County had what they called a bar picnic every summer. This was in 1971. It wasn't really outside. Maybe we had drinks outside, but dinner was inside. A hotel kind of place, I guess. I can't remember exactly. The little firm had bought a dinner table. I'm sitting at the dinner table with lawyers from my firm. After dinner, a couple of people made speeches, and then this lawyer gets up, whoever he is, clinks for quiet, and says, the stripper will be in room such and so. And I got up faster than the speed of light and was heading to room such and so to raise a huge fuss. And Bill Anderson, who I guess he was still an associate then, and Tom Seymour, my now husband, dragged me out of there. But I tell you, the Tulsa County Bar never did that again. Can you imagine?
No. And again, that was in
71.
Were you the only female then?
Oh, there must have been a couple
the firm?
others. Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. I think when I graduated from law school, 3% of the law graduates in the country were female, and that was 1965. Women didn't start going in numbers until in the 70s.
We'll talk more about it, but you were first in many cases, many situations, and
Yeah.
definitely back then.
But there was only one federal judge here, and I hated state court because federal court had a lot more rules, and it's sort of crazy in state court. More people wing it. I don't like winging it. So I was mostly writing briefs in federal court, and I'd be in court second chairing or sometime making arguments for summary judgment. And the one federal judge here loved me. So it was gentlemen and Mrs. Seymour whenever in the courtroom. And one time, this was after I became a judge. I have to tell you this story, though, because he was down the hall. He had a career law clerk. We called her Judge Marilyn because she ran all the settlement conference. And I was in a settlement conference across the hall from his chambers with some lawyers from Oklahoma City on a case. We took a break to go to the bathroom, and then coming up the hall back towards this way was the women's bathroom, and the men had to go around the end of the hall, go out and go to the men's bathroom. I go to the ladies' room, and I'm walking back down the hall. Judge Barrow comes out of his chambers in his robe to cross the hall to go into his courtroom. He sees me, and he turns to me, and he throws his arms around me to give me a hug. So when the guys from Oklahoma City come back around the corner, the judge in his robes has his arm around me, and I'm like this, and I wave at them over his shoulders. They settled the case.
There you go.
Got to take advantage.
Yes, right. There was a president who comes into your life.
Yes, there is. Thank goodness. Jimmy Carter. You probably know from talking to people how federal judges are usually picked. They're chosen by the party of the president in office. The senators in that party usually propose a person for a federal judgeship. Jimmy Carter wanted women and minorities and set up merit nominating commissions specifically for that purpose because they weren't getting chosen in this all-male system. So my husband, Tom, encouraged me to apply. 1978 was when I interviewed. There were 11 people on this commission, 6 of whom were lawyers and 5 of whom were lay people, including 2 women. You have an application process. You applied, and then they decide who they're going to interview. The same commission had done the same thing in Kansas and Utah a year or 2 years before me and had no women applicants because there just weren't very many women. In Oklahoma, there were 2 applicants out of, I think, 35 total. Me and Elma Wilson, she was a state trial judge then and ended up on the Oklahoma Supreme Court subsequently. I don't know how many they interviewed, but I had an interview with all these people, and they asked me questions. Then I waited to see what happened, and I didn't hear this story until many years later, and it was told to me by one of the female non-lawyers who was on this commission. She was from Denver, and she told me that when they sat around the room, these 11 people, their job was to give 3 to 5 names to the president to choose from. The chairman of this group was a 70-year-old trial lawyer from Wyoming. He said, we're going to go around the room, and everybody's going to throw out somebody who's obviously not qualified. He said, I'll start. And he threw my name out. This woman from Denver is sitting around the other side of the table. She said, I was in shock because I thought you were pretty well qualified. And she said, she's really well qualified. Why do you think she isn't? And he said, she has 4 children. She couldn't possibly handle the job. She was dumbfounded and didn't know what to say. But by the time it got around to her, and she's only halfway around the table, she throws out the name of a justice on the Oklahoma Supreme Court who happened to be the chair's favorite candidate. And he said, what? He's obviously well qualified. She said, no, he's not. He's got 5 children, couldn't possibly handle the job. So they had a conversation about whether that was a disqualifying factor, said, maybe it's not, and put my name back in. And he and I both ended up on the list.
Wow.
Yeah.
The challenge of her
Yes.
was fortuitous, obviously,
Yes,
for you.
Totally.
Yeah.
And to think of that response.
It was great.
Mm-hmm.
Here we are, December 5th, 2019, and Jimmy Carter is now 95 years old, and I
Yes.
believe he's still in the hospital.
I don't know. He just went in for something.
But he's been in and out several times, and what a role model for people who are older and
Yeah.
want to be active and
Yeah.
Habitat for Humanity and all of that.
Yeah.
Did you get to meet him and be around him
I
much?
didn't get to meet him when this process was going on, but I did 5 years ago, probably now. They had a celebration for him in Arizona connected with something, and I went specifically because I wanted to meet him. He's just the world's nicest guy. I'll tell you another story I heard. It made me wonder how much Rosalind Carter had to do with pushing for women, because a lawyer in the little firm I worked for heard this from somebody after I got picked for the job. There was a guy from Oklahoma City who wanted the position, and he'd been a big Carter supporter when Carter came to Oklahoma to campaign. After Carter got elected, Chip called him up and said, if there's anything we can do for you, you just call me and let me know, and gave him his number. So he called Chip and said, I would really like to be appointed to the Tenth Circuit. Chip said, hold on a minute, let me see what I can find out, put it on hold, was gone a long time, and came back and said, nope, can't happen. There's a woman named Seymour, and Mama wants her.
Oh, Chip meaning the son of President.
Of President Carter, Mama being Rosalind. So she obviously had talking in her husband's ear.
Maybe it was her idea to set up these nominating commissions.
I just don't know.
Did the president name other women then at the same?
11 to the Circuit Courts of Appeals. And there'd only been 2 ever in history, one under President Roosevelt on the Sixth Circuit and one that Johnson appointed to the Ninth Circuit. That really opened the gates, because by the time Reagan got in, he appointed another female colleague in 85.
You joined a historic class of women judges then in 79. Weren't there 23 females?
There were 11 on the circuit court, I think maybe more than that, and a number on the federal trial bench. I can't remember exactly. There have been as many as 40.
How were you notified that the president had selected you?
I just got a call, not from him, but somebody in the Justice Department, I think.
Do they just say you're in, or what do they say?
Yeah, they said that I was, and then there had to be FBI and ABA background checks.
The American Bar Association, did they approve of you?
Well, that's another interesting story. The way the American Bar Association is set up, there's one person in the circuit who's appointed to interview prospective federal judgeship positions and then report to a committee. I was interviewed by this guy who didn't ask me anything about my career or my ability. He basically said, you got 4 children, how are you going to handle the job kind of questions. I think it was like a 10-minute interview, and then he proposed to rate me unqualified because he said I didn't have enough trial experience. Now, keep in mind, I'm not a trial lawyer. I'm a backup person writing briefs for the most part, or arguing motions to dismiss or summary judgment, not arguing to a jury. A woman in the Justice Department called me and said, this is what he's proposing. I immediately wrote a letter to the Attorney General of the United States, who's head of the Justice Department, and I said, under your rules, you're supposed to be given due process. You've heard a lot about that recently. You're supposed to be giving due process. If you're going to tell somebody you're not qualified, you have to tell them why. I said, nobody told me anything. So they looked into it, and they ended up re-interviewing me. A guy who, I think he'd been head of the American Bar Association from California, came out to interview me again and ask me all kinds of questions like he was supposed to. Then they proposed to waive me qualified.
Wow.
Yeah. Luck of the draw.
Did you ever wonder, you don't sound like me, or is it because I'm a female, or what is it?
It's because I was female.
Yeah, of course.
Because in 79, there still weren't very many of us on courts, or even lawyering.
So you became the first woman on the Tenth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals.
Yes.
There's another first. And you served as the court's first female chief judge.
Yeah, it's a 7-year term to be chief. I'm about 58 at the time, I think, because the guy who did it just prior to me, Judge McKay, only did it for a couple of years, and then he took senior status. You have to be an active judge to be chief. I became chief judge in 94. When you're chief, it's interesting because I hated the job because it's all kinds of administrative junk, I call it. I much prefer judging than doing that kind of stuff. But you're basically chief over the whole circuit, which includes the district courts and the magistrate judges. You get all the judicial misconduct complaints alleged against any judge. And there are a gazillion by pro se prisoners. So I hated that. I really debated about whether I was going to keep doing it, because I could have waived it and the next person would have gotten the job. But as chief of the circuit, you go to the Judicial Conference of the United States, which consists of the chief of the Supreme Court, the chief judge of each circuit, and a district court representative from each circuit. So there are 22 chief judges of the circuit. There's 11 circuit judges and 11 district court judges and the Chief Justice of the United States. And they make policy decisions about things. When I went to my first judicial conference, there were only 2 other women there around this table. And I decided, I need to stay. So I did my whole 7-year term.
And you were the first female to preside over one of the sessions of the U.S. Judicial Conference.
Yes. Well, the Chief Justice was Rehnquist. He always wanted to move things fast, and so there would be times when we still had stuff to do, and he didn't want to participate, so he'd say, I'm out of here, you do it. And that's how that happened. He liked me. He was a really big guy. I'm short. I'm not quite 5'2", and he was quite tall. When I first met him, he looked down at me and said, I thought you'd be taller. But it was an interesting process sitting on the Judicial Conference.
What was he like to be around and work with?
He was very nice to me. He liked me. We had lunch. He didn't like to go past lunch for these sessions. We sat at tables of 10 for lunch, and every lunch that I went to the Judicial Conference, he had me sit by him. So sometimes there's an advantage to being female.
Did you enjoy sparring, or was it just...
No, just talking.
Yeah. When judges get together, do you talk about the law, or do you talk about...
Everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
Right.
My court, Tenth Circuit, when I first went on, had 8 judges, and we had a very nice practice of getting together for dinner every night. The way it works is we sat for a week every other month. So I would go to Denver. The court sits in Denver, which is where it's based, and I would go for a week and hear 6 cases every day, which is like final exams all the time, getting prepared for that. But we'd get together for dinner. And that was just always a very nice thing to do because it keeps up the collegiality.
Mm-hmm. Because during the day, then you don't see each other.
Well, we sit together in panels of 3.
Panels of 3.
Yeah.
All right.
We used to sit in the morning, 4 cases in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. But then we reduced the time, and now we hear 6 in the morning.
The 10th Circuit, that encompasses...
6 states.
6 states.
Yeah. Oklahoma, Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, Utah, New Mexico. Yes. The cases come from the trial courts in all of those states on appeal, and the lawyers come to Denver to argue.
The name obviously states appeals, but tell us then what kind of cases are coming to you on appeal. Decisions have been made, but for one reason or another, they say we're going to appeal this to the Supreme Court, and it has to come to you first. Yeah. Tell us about that.
Well, the losing party tries to think of a reason to get the lower court reversed. There are all kinds of cases, which is what makes this job so fascinating. For one thing, we have what's called diversity cases. Mostly in federal court, you have federal questions. It could be Indian law, it could be environmental law, it could be federal criminal law. But there are diversity cases where if you have a case that ordinarily would go to state court, but you have parties from 2 different states, that's called diversity. Then one of the parties can remove the case to federal court. Those cases can involve all kinds of state law questions too. Not divorce, because they're in a separate court. So we just go to contract cases, for example, tort cases. Or if there is, say, a tort on federal land, like this post office that we're in, that would go to federal court. Or a criminal case, somebody did something to the post office, that would go to federal court because it's federal land. Or if you rob a bank, that goes to federal court. If you rob a federal bank.
What percentage are criminal cases?
It used to be about 25%. I don't know what it is now. And the worst of those are the death penalty cases. First thing I did when I took senior status was say I'm not sitting on any death penalty cases because they're awful. I mean, they're hard. You've got somebody's life. I sat on 2 over the course of my career where it turned out the defendant was actually innocent. And once you sit on one of those, you think, oh my gosh. The first one, John Grisham wrote a book about called The Innocent Man.
Yes.
That was a case I sat on. And when he was tried in state court, he filed a federal habeas. That is when you claim your state court conviction was unconstitutional. He argued he had ineffective assistance of counsel. You have a Sixth Amendment right to effective assistance of counsel. Judge C, the district judge, granted the habeas and said ineffective assistance of counsel. Came up to the circuit. We affirmed that opinion. Then he would have to be retried with new counsel. It was DNA that came out just about that time. And I think this was the case where there was very little evidence other than a witness testifying that the guy left the bar with the victim. I don't know if he had a second trial or not, but somewhere in the process, DNA established that it wasn't him, it was the witness against him, DNA. How's that? Scary, huh?
It is scary. Were you personally opposed to the death penalty?
I was, and I had a real difficult time deciding if I wanted to apply for this job because of that. But because you have a jury, it was an appellate position, and you follow the law, I decided I could do it. That doesn't mean I like to, but yes. And I affirmed a lot of them.
How did that play with your mind?
I found it difficult, especially after the actual innocence case.
By the time it came to you, there were so many who had made decisions on that
yes.
You just had to stamp it and move on.
Well, you always had lots of issues, but they're legal issues, so I'm not deciding facts.
No.
That's the only way I could talk myself into sitting on those cases.
We've been talking about Justice Rehnquist and your interaction with him. Curious about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, recently in the news because she's now cancer-free, a 4-time cancer survivor, second female justice to be named after Sandra Day O'Connor, along with Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan. And she's now 86 years old, and her health has been an issue for some time and in the news. So I'm hoping you had some interaction with her.
I did. She was one of the 11 women that President Jimmy Carter appointed to the Federal Courts of Appeals, the group I was in. Most of us were appointed in 1979. She came in, I think, early 1980. So I met her. I met all the women when we had judicial conferences in Washington. She was always kind of shy. This is an interesting point. Each Circuit Court of Appeals has a circuit justice from the Supreme Court appointed, and that justice comes to our judicial conferences each year and whatever else we can get them to do. When I went on the court, Justice White was our circuit justice, and then I think it was Steve Breyer after that. Ruth Ginsburg was appointed our circuit justice, I think in 1994. I've been trying to look it up, but I can't find it. She came to our judicial conference. It happened to be that year that my first female colleague on the court, Danil Taha, who was a really fun person, she and a federal district judge in Colorado created a play for the judges to put on at the judicial conference, and it was called Phantom of the Courthouse. And it was very funny from beginning to end. One of the things that they came up with for us women judges, and I think there were only 4 of us at the time, Danelle and I and 2 district court judges, we were to do a striptease by taking off our black robes. We were up on the stage with our judicial robes on. They were playing bump and grind music, and we were up there slowly unzipping our robes to bump and grind music. And, of course, there's lawyers and judges at this judicial conference. They thought it was hysterical, except for Justice White, who was sort of scandalized. But Ruth was sitting there next to him, and she saw us start, and she got up and came up on the stage with us. She didn't have a robe on, but she was standing up there sort of moving around and bumping and grinding with us as we were doing that. Just an interesting side of her that you don't usually see, because she actually is a fairly shy person. She had a very outgoing husband, Marty Ginsburg, who was terrific.
But it's interesting about her because she's often first to ask a question.
Yes, that's different. She's in her role.
Yeah.
I mean, she was a fabulous teacher in law school before she went on the court. When she's in her role, she's fine. It's just her personality.
Yeah. So you and Tom, your husband, did you have interaction with her and her husband?
We did. When we went to D.C. for something, they invited us over for dinner. We had dinner with them in Washington. I think it was the year after.
And she did all the cooking?
No, she didn't do any of the cooking. Marty Ginsburg was a fabulous cook. He loved to cook. He said that at one point he and the kids threw her out of the kitchen because she wasn't a very good cook and she wasn't very interested in it. I think probably when she went on the Supreme Court, she probably quit cooking.
Yeah.
There is actually a cookbook out with Marty Ginsburg's recipes that the Supreme Court put out after he died.
Then he was quite a cook.
Oh, he was a brilliant tax lawyer, but he was also a terrific cook and a very laid-back guy. He carried in his suit pocket a small flask of Campari, which is what she liked to drink.
Oh.
He took care of her.
She obviously represents the liberal wing of the party, but when she came on, was she more moderate, do you think?
Things have just changed. The law progresses, so it changes over time. I can't remember. I think she was always leaning in that direction.
Well, she spent a good part of her career in the advancement of gender equality and women's rights.
Yes.
Which was right up your alley.
Yeah.
And you were the same way.
It was at a time when that was changing.
So you were often first. She was, as we pointed out, the second female justice. She had to be a lot of first female on her walk.
Oh, I'm sure she was.
On her walk.
And actually, she and I were up for consideration for that Supreme Court position when she got it.
You were too?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize that.
It actually was publicized somewhere, yeah. I wasn't pushing for it because I didn't want it. Her husband was campaigning for her. I forbid my husband to campaign for me because I liked being here and I don't like publicity interfering in my life. I hate all of that. So I really didn't want it.
Your name was selected by?
Well, it was put out there by Clinton and the administration.
So were you one of two or many? Or
I have no idea. All I know is what I read in the paper.
Right. But probably relieved that you didn't get it.
Absolutely.
But a nice honor to have been considered.
Yes. Well, there were so few of us women out there that...
It limited the pool.
Yeah, and a lot of them were older, so...
Right. But what a compliment. I didn't know that. And for the sake of history and those who listen back, I just wanted to name the present Supreme Court justices and see if you had any interaction. Like Clarence Thomas, he served the longest now, 28 years. Did you ever have back and forth with him?
I sat on moot court with him at Chicago when he was on the D.C. Circuit. That's when I first met him. And I sat with the University of Kansas moot court with him after he was a justice. And he came here. He had a connection to Oral Roberts University. He came here to speak one time and called up and asked me if he could come by my chambers, which he did. Sat here and yacked with my law clerks. He's a very friendly guy.
This is interesting. Here's Justice Ginsburg, shy, and she's the first one out there. So you would think that maybe Clarence Thomas was shy, and now you say he's gregarious, but he doesn't ask any questions.
I know. I asked him.
You asked him?
I asked him about that. He really didn't want to talk about it. I think the reason he doesn't is because there was all that flap about him when he was up for the position, and it just so offended him that it's now his shtick. And when I talked to him when he was here, I said, it's just your shtick. You're smart. You could ask tons of questions. He gave me a shrug.
So he's carried a grudge for 28 years?
No, I don't think it's a grudge anymore. It's just the way he is.
Right. Stephen Breyer?
Stephen Breyer was actually our circuit justice for a couple of years. What happens is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court selects where the Supreme Court members are going to be circuit justices, and I'm sure they give him some input. So when the First Circuit opened up, which is where Breyer was from, when he sat on the Court of Appeals, the chief moved him from our circuit to that circuit. Ginsburg was only our circuit justice 1 year, and the Second Circuit opened up. So he moved her to the Second Circuit, and she actually had so much fun out here, she asked if she could have two circuits, because a couple of them do, and he said, no, the Second Circuit will keep you busy.
Mm-hmm. And the Second Circuit is?
New York, which is where she was on the Court of Appeals.
He served 25 years to this point. Then Judge Roberts has served 14. He came on much later. Did you have any?
I've met him at judicial conferences, and that's pretty much it.
Samuel Alito served 13 years.
He came to one of our judicial conferences. It's a tradition in our circuit, probably others too, that the circuit justice who's assigned often brings one of the other justices to our judicial conferences, and typically after they've been put on the court. So Alito came 1 year after he became a Supreme Court justice. Gorsuch was there last time, and I suspect that Kavanaugh will be brought. I don't know for sure. Our current circuit justice is Justice Sotomayor.
Sonia Sotomayor has served 10 years, and you mentioned earlier you had a phone call with her, so you're in communication a fair amount with her?
Not a fair amount, just when something's up.
Elena Kagan served 9 years.
I've met her at judicial conferences, and she actually came and talked. I think she and Gorsuch were friendly in some connection, and he brought her out here before he went on the court. He brought her out here, and she came to one of our judicial conferences.
Neil Gorsuch has served 2 years, 9 months.
Was my colleague, Tenth Circuit for 10 years.
So obviously you enjoyed that relationship.
Yeah.
And then Brett Kavanaugh, the most recent, has served 1 year, 3 months.
I have not met.
So, for those who listen back, that's our current lineup of the justices. As I read them, you probably said, as some people will say, wouldn't want to be you, but I'm glad you're doing it, right?
Yes.
How about Sandra Day O'Connor? Were you around her much?
Actually, yes, because she and Robert Henry became good buddies. They were on a committee somewhere. I think it was International Committee. So he had her out here. She had come to several of our judicial conferences at his behest. She was chief at one point.
Yes, and she was the first female on the Supreme Court.
Yes.
How many courts of appeals are there in the United States?
11 now.
11. In this 10th Circuit, is it true we have 7 Democrats and 5 Republicans?
Currently,
Yeah.
that's one of the interesting things about the federal court system that I love. Some people have a problem with the political process of picking people, and the president's party gets to
Right.
pick the current one. But it goes back and forth so much, and it's just who takes. I took senior status. I had friends try to convince me not to take senior status on my birthday when I turned 65, which is when I was eligible, because it was right before an election. They said, what if a Republican gets in and you'll be replaced by a Republican? And I said, I believe in the system. And the system, because we have lifetime appointments, it really takes a lot of the politics out of it, because you're not subject to, unlike state court where you have to run for election, being a judge, you're not subject to politics. You may have views about things, but you're really deciding the law. And I was replaced by a Republican, Jerome Holmes in Oklahoma City, who happens to be black, which I thought was great. He's a very moderate Republican, a super colleague. But it goes back and forth. When I first became chief, I think there was 1 or 2 Democrats and the rest were Republican. But you see how much it's changed, because it goes back and forth, and that will continue to change.
Once it's all settled down and you're all together working, do you really think that some are thinking Republican, some are thinking Democrat?
No, I think some of us are more liberal. I've always been fairly liberal in my views, and some are more conservative, but not in a political sense, more in a philosophical sense. I would say probably 95% of our cases, it makes absolutely no difference. So we're talking about a small number of cases where your views might make you lean one way or another way.
Yeah, the environment.
But then you've got law. You have precedent. We have to follow precedent. We can't make up law. So we're bound by precedent. We can be overruled by the Supreme Court. But it's a very intellectually exciting process to me. I think the federal court system is great.
I think it'd be interesting to study. You said you considered yourself liberal and some are conservative. What leads to someone becoming liberal or becoming a conservative thinker?
Part of where you grow up, my father was very liberal. Michigan was very much a Democratic state, very labor-oriented when I grew up there. Actually, my father's father was a lawyer and a judge. I didn't know much about that because he was fairly old when I knew him. But after my father died, it's a pretty fascinating story. After my father died, I found papers of his, and I discovered that my grandfather, who was a Republican when I knew him, ran for city council in 1917, ran for the Battle Creek City Council as a socialist. There you go.
Yeah, and we had the fear of socialism, didn't we?
Oh, yeah, we did. But by the time I knew him, he was Republican. So,
your first days when you have your nomination and you are now on the 10th Circuit, what did you have to do? Let's just start at the beginning. Hire staff or what?
Oh, yes, I had to hire staff. I had a secretary and 2 law clerks. That was the first thing you do. But I was confirmed August 31st, I think, and I immediately sat on the November term of court. It was wild. So I had a couple of weeks to read the briefs. I can't remember. I think I just sat one day, but there was an en banc. This is also a funny story. There was an en banc. So I had 6 cases to read the briefs in, and in the en banc.
I got to ask you, what does that mean?
Our cases are decided by a panel of 3 of our judges. And the losing party can file a petition for rehearing en banc, saying this is a very significant question. Your case conflicts with cases in other circuits, or the circuits are split. So they're asking the entire court, all of the judges, all the active judges. There were 8 when I started, then we went to 10, now we're 12. They're petitioning that group body to hear the case en banc, all of the judges. Those judges are polled, so you have a polling and they vote on whether to take it up en banc. So there was a case that was en banc to be heard the second day I was going to sit. I think I sat on Monday. I woke up that morning throwing up. I was sicker than a dog. And I thought, oh my God, they're all going to think I'm afraid to show up. But when I called home, the kids were throwing up. So I didn't sit on the en banc. That was part of my first experience. But it was a lot of work. There were some cases, Supreme Court cases that came down, I don't remember what, that caused a lot of pro se people to file cases in the 80s. And we were getting tons of those. And the caseload in the 80s was increasing 16% a year. So our caseload was going up like crazy. And it got to be a big workload preparing for court, writing the cases. 3 judges hear argument on the panel, and then after argument, we vote on the cases. We talk about how we think they should come out. And the chief of the panel is the most senior active judge on the panel of 3. That person decides which among the 3 are going to write the case for the panel. That's how the opinions get written. And you send out a draft to just those 3 judges, and somebody might dissent. If they're going to dissent, they let you know, and they write a dissent. You go back and forth, and then the opinion goes out and gets published. Then the party who loses can file a petition for rehearing en banc, or they can file a petition for certiorari to the Supreme Court if they think they have a case.
We've given plenty of rights, haven't we?
Yes.
Our Constitution, from the beginning, sought that.
Yes. That's one thing great about our system.
Yeah.
It's a very fair process.
My mind is jumping to the jailhouse lawyers. They keep looking for ways to have an appeal. Did you deal with that?
Of course. And my husband does criminal law.
Okay.
So if you want to refer to criminal lawyers as jailhouse lawyers, you can. There's all kinds of lawyers. He happens to be very smart.
Well, I was thinking about the criminals who are in jail.
Oh, the pro se.
They're known as jailhouse lawyers.
Oh, okay.
I wasn't talking about real lawyers.
Okay. Yes, they can file pro se.
And they all of a sudden think they're lawyers.
Well, they have access to law books. Some of them are pretty good.
They're pretty good, you say?
Oh, yeah. Some of them are smart and use the access they have to law books.
But when they
Most of them are just silly.
But they don't come to your
level.
No.
They don't. That's pro se. And if it comes to our level, usually a lawyer will be appointed to represent them. But they can file, like I said, prisoner pro se petitions. They sit in jail and file stuff, and you have to deal with that. They don't have a lawyer.
You have to get up to speed on many, many different issues.
Yes, we do, which is why this job is fascinating, because we have so many different issues. I like that.
When Penn Square Bank collapsed, you were there. Tell us about your experience.
Not my favorite. Bankruptcy law is not my favorite kind of law. I don't remember anything specifically. We got a ton of cases out of that.
Energy-related issues, of course.
Yeah.
Here we have oil and gas in our state. Well, not just our state, but the region.
Yeah, and it's a learning process because, of course, I never had an oil and gas case in law school. Or Indian law. We have a lot of Indian law cases, which are fascinating.
Was there any area that you enjoyed the most?
Oh, I like constitutional law issues. You should ask me about my most famous case, which
was?
Now I can read the briefs on my iPad, but they used to all be printed off. I've actually gone back to that because I like to scribble on them. But I would be sitting for 5 days on the library table out there would be the stacks of briefs. So I'm out there looking through just the preliminary, and I see Brown versus Board of Education.
Yeah.
This was like 88 or 89, I can't remember. And I'm going, what? And it's got a really old case number on it. Well, I'm reading the briefs, and I find out that the little girl You might have noticed, you may not have noticed out there, I have a print of her up on the wall. The little girl in Brown versus Board. By the time the Supreme Court decided it in 1954 and sent it back to Federal District Court in Topeka, Kansas to desegregate with all deliberate speech, she'd graduated from high school. The case sat there. I don't know where the lawyer was, but the case was never closed. Usually the district court will close a case, and that'll be the end of it. It was still open, the original case, and when that little girl became a mom, and her little girl was starting school in still segregated schools in Topeka, Kansas, because they never did anything about it, she reopened the original case and argued that the school system in Topeka had never been desegregated. A district judge said, "Oh, you can't do this, it's late," and threw it out, came up to my court. She attached a lot of evidence that they were still desegregated. We said, "Oh, yes, you can." Sent it back down, and they ended up creating a magnet school system in Topeka, Kansas.
Wow. Wasn't that fun to be part of that?
That was fabulous for that.
Yeah.
I mean, it was shocking. I had no idea that the case had never ended.
You are essentially reviewing the work of other judges.
Yes.
So are you kind to these judges?
I'm kind. I believe in being kind. Most of us are kind.
But you have to push back.
Well, you have to reverse them when they're wrong. And sometimes, we have things like due process of law in our Constitution. What the heck does that mean? That's been decided over many years by cases, but that's a broad term, or equal protection of the law. So sometimes it isn't clear. And that's one trial judge who's making a decision of the law and how it applies in a case. And it comes up to us, and there's 3 judges, and we're rethinking that. So it's not always the trial judge. It's just sometimes the law is vague and needs clarification, and we do that. Sometimes it's misapplied. Sometimes it's because the lawyers write such crummy briefs in some cases that they don't educate the trial judge sufficiently about the law. Sometimes the law changes between when it's done in the trial court and when it gets to the circuit. So there are all kinds of different situations. You have to ask the trial judges how they feel getting reversed.
Well, you probably know how they feel.
I got reversed a couple times by the Supreme Court.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
How did you handle that?
Oh, I had to redo a case once, but it ended up, I think Scalia wrote the opinion. I can't even remember what the issue was. We had to rehear it, and I rewrote it, and I came out the same way. This process is interesting.
Right.
I'm still doing it because I love it. Senior judges, that's one thing that's fascinating about federal court. We love our jobs. 25% of the entire federal judiciary, appellate and trial, are people like me, and I'm working for you for free. Because when I turned 65, I got full salary for life, and I could have quit and gone into practice. But I didn't, because I love my job. So it's a pension now. I'm working. I could be working someplace else.
And drawing this pension.
Right. But 25% of the entire federal judiciary trial and appellate are people like me.
Because
it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And because I could reduce my load. I went originally to 40%, and then I recently went down to 25% because I travel a lot.
You just told me before, you got a call today from Justice Sotomayor.
Yeah. The message was she wants to ask about a Tulsa lawyer. I have no idea what, because when I called back from home, since I sort of dawdled my wind. Now, well, apparently she did too, because when I called back, it was her office number. She wasn't in yet. So I have to call her back and see what she wants. But she's our circuit justice, and I know her personally.
I've met her, and obviously she's a real pleasing, easy person to get along with. So will you just get a call on your desk and the justice will be on the phone? Or
That's not common, but every now and then something comes up.
Our former Attorney General, our former Dean of Law School, our former President of Oklahoma City University, nominated to the bench by Bill Clinton in '94, Robert Henry, and the 2 of you were on the circuit at the same time.
Yes. He became a good friend. He's a delightful guy. We had a lot of fun.
And so you would work on cases together.
But we're randomly selected for cases. That's a very significant point. Once upon a time, the chief of the circuit put the panels together of 3, just sort of picked them. That went out sometime in the 80s when actually a Republican judge says, shouldn't we be doing this randomly? And we all said yes. So which judges sit on a panel could end up being all Democrat appointments, all Republican appointments are a mixture because it's done by computer, the panels.
Okay.
So it's a very fair process. And shortly after Danelle Taha, the second female on the court, got appointed, we ended up with an all-female panel because there was a district court judge from Denver who was sitting with us. We had visiting judges when our caseload was growing so fast. She was sitting with us, and we got randomly selected as an all-female panel. And the looks on the faces of some of the guy lawyers when they came in the courtroom was kind of funny.
Let's jump to some cases. The Oklahoma City bombing, April 19, 1995. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols were to be tried in our state. But it would seem this would not be a fair place to try them. You were one of two judges that got involved with that, and you took charge of it immediately.
Because I was chief when that happened. And all of the federal district court judges in Oklahoma City recused. So I had to decide who was going to try the case. The whole process was so shocking because when it happened, I immediately called Bill Holloway in Oklahoma City, and nobody answered the phone. I tried all kinds of people. Nobody answered the phone in the federal courthouse. I mean, it was shocking because that was right across the... Robert Henry told me afterwards glass was broken in his windows of his chambers, but he happened not to be at his desk at the time. I mean,
in the federal building near...
In the federal building across from where it occurred.
From the Murrah building.
Yeah. So all the trial judges in Oklahoma City recused, and it's the responsibility of the chief of the circuit to replace judges when judges recuse, all of them. So I came down here and I pulled out books where I could read who all the trial judges in the circuit were. And I picked Dick Mage, trial judge in Denver, a Republican appointee who I considered him one of the fairest judges I knew because he was. He just was. So I called him up. He said, okay. So I was the one that selected him to try the case.
He moved the case then to Denver.
Yes, because that's where he is, which was a good idea because it got out of where, I mean, it would have been bad to do it here where it happened, especially in Oklahoma City.
Right. Not many people know that story, how that happened.
Yeah.
What kind of a court would he run, Richard Mage?
He'd been in the military, worked at a stand-up desk, was a stand-up guy. That's one of the reasons I picked him, because he's fair, but he ran a tight ship. So he did. He's the kind of judge that listens to both sides.
People in Oklahoma City and in Oklahoma wanted to get their pound of blood or what have you, or gallon, and I suppose that was upsetting to many that it was being moved out of Oklahoma.
I don't know. I mean,
No.
I'm sure a lot of the public might have thought that, but, you know, you really didn't want to try it in a building where the windows were broken because it was
Yeah.
across the street where the bombing occurred, which is why all the federal judges over there recused.
We have the interview with Stephen Jones, who defended Timothy McVeigh. Those of you who are interested in this case, you can listen to his interview. In fact, Judge Mage, he died this year, didn't he?
Yes, he did. It's very sad.
As you said, you have a special interest in Native American rights, and you served on the Joint Federal Tribal Relations Committee of the Ninth and Tenth Circuits, founding member of the Oklahoma State Federal Trial and Judicial Council. You wrote an interesting decision shielding Indian tribal casinos from Oklahoma taxation. Talk to us about that.
Indian law basically didn't exist as taught in law schools when I went to law school, and I didn't know anything about it until I moved to Oklahoma. I didn't have any cases when I was a practicing lawyer. I had to learn Indian law when I became a federal judge. I think we still have 39 tribes here. Oklahoma was Indian country. As you know, when 5 civilized tribes were kicked out of the East, they settled here. It wasn't a state at the time. Most states have reservations that have been set up for Native Americans. We don't have reservations here. The Native Americans own their land in fee simple because they were here for the white guys were here.
Do we call that sovereign?
Yes. They did treaties with the federal government in the early 1900s because settlers, white settlers, were coming out here. And the tribes had jurisdiction over a huge amount of the whole state, basically. So the federal government paid them money to reduce their boundaries so that white settlers could come and actually own the land. That was a process that occurred mostly in the early 1900s. I had a case, it was in the 80s, I think, late 80s. Creek Nation bingo, as you know. Bingo became a great moneymaker, and they were going to build a casino on their land here. And the state said, no, you can't. Or the state wanted to tax them. I can't even remember what the facts were, but I got the case, really learned about Indian law, and ended up holding the state could not tell them what to do. It was their land, and they were sovereign nation. That was one of the early cases, and I'm going to now tell you about a current case because it's fascinating. About a year ago, I can't remember his name, a Creek Indian was tried in state court for murder and was convicted. A lawyer here in town who does a lot of Indian law, who wasn't involved in the original case, filed a habeas petition in federal court claiming that he was wrongfully convicted because the boundaries of the Creek Nation were never lawfully disestablished. That's what they called it in the early 1900s. There's been a bunch of cases, including a Supreme Court case. They had to use certain language in the treaty to make it clear that the tribe was giving up its sovereign land. And this lawyer filed in federal court claiming that the state trial was unconstitutional because this was still Indian land, still part of the Creek Nation, because the boundaries were never properly disestablished. He lost in trial court here, panel of my court, I wasn't on it, in a 120-page opinion, reversed and said, oops, they didn't use the right language and the boundaries were never disestablished. There are 1.8 million Oklahomans that are not Indian within those boundaries, including all of Tulsa County. How's that? Tim Timkovich was on the panel. It was written by Scott Matheson, who was appointed by Obama. Anyway, he wrote the opinion, and there were 2 Democrats, and Tim, a Republican from Denver, were on the panel, and he joined it, and I sat with him on a panel shortly after that. I said, okay, Tim, I'm kind of surprised. He said, I can't tell you how hard I tried and my 4 law clerks tried not to come out that way, but it was your blankety-blank opinion in 1989. So anyway, he joined the opinion that was unanimous in the Tenth Circuit. The state filed a petition for certiorari with the Supreme Court and asked the Tenth Circuit to stay its effectiveness of the opinion pending Supreme Court review, pending certiorari, till the case has been stayed. So for the moment, it isn't applicable. We are still in the state of Oklahoma as Tulsans. Went to the Supreme Court. They granted certiorari. They heard argument last spring, and my former colleague, Neil Gorsuch, who was on my court for 10 years, recused. So there are only 8 justices deciding this case. And everybody thinks they're split 4-4 because they didn't come out with an opinion, and they said they were going to hear it re-argued this fall. They were going to re-argue it. That hasn't happened yet. I'm totally speculating because I haven't talked to Gorsuch, but he and Timkovich were good friends. They were both in Denver, both on our court. My guess is Tim went down and sat in his office and said, oh my God, look at this case. What am I going to do? Help me figure this out. And that's why he recused. But now we've got a Supreme Court that's...
So what's going to happen if they're 4-4?
I don't know. They haven't re-argued it. Congress could fix it because Congress is over all of us. Federal, state, Congress could pass a law fixing this treaty. But whether it's able to do that or not, I don't know. It's fascinating. Isn't that fascinating?
It is fascinating.
We might be in the middle. And if we are in the Creek Nation, then these crimes like murder would be tried in federal court by law. There's a statute that said major crimes committed in Indian country are tried in federal court, not in state court.
It would turn everything upside down here, wouldn't
Yeah,
it?
it would. We wouldn't have any state taxes.
Right.
We might get some Creek Indian taxes. Murphy versus somebody is the name of the case.
Currently in our state, here in 2019, we have an impasse between Governor Kevin Stitt and the major 5 tribes regarding the gaming compacts. You may have a comment on it. I do this for historical value for those who are listening back. The tribes earn $4.5 billion each year thanks to casino-style gaming, and of that money, anywhere from 4 to 10% goes back to the state in exclusivity fees. The 15-year deal is set to expire in January. The governor wants to renegotiate the terms of the agreement. Tribes say the compact automatically renews if new agreements aren't reached, but the governor disagrees. I don't know if you have an opinion.
I don't, because I haven't read any of it, but that's a fun legal question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is what makes my job so fun. Fascinating questions.
Yeah. The tribes have come together, the 5 major tribes united for Oklahoma. I read on their website last night, there's not a sector in this state untouched by the tribes. Oklahoma Native Americans are leading the way when it comes to funding schools, building hospitals, constructing roads, repairing bridges, operating businesses, and supporting communities.
Well, it's clear that the casinos are their big money maker. A lot of them were in a lot of poverty before they started operating casinos.
I think they've reached out to the Fed level. I don't know how far this could go.
It will be tried in federal court.
Yeah. You left the chief judgeship in 2000, and you assumed the senior status, as we've talked about, in 2005. Yep. Janet Leavitt, who is now the provost at the University of Tulsa, former dean of the law school, was a law clerk for you in 94 and 95.
Yes, she was.
Because of Janet and about 50 others who clerked for you, they established the Judge Stephanie K. Seymour Lectureship in Law at TU.
Yes.
Isn't that a nice honor?
It's a fabulous honor because the people who speak at it are law professors who aren't tenured. That's part of it. It's for young, up-and-coming law professors, and they always find some fascinating person, some fascinating topic to come once a year. It's great. I love it. And she's great. She's also a good friend. I'll tell you how I hired her, which is a fun story, because we get tons of applications from all over the country for law clerk positions. Most of them are highly qualified. It's often very difficult to pick. I was in the process of looking at things. I get a call from David Boren, and he said, "You really should hire Janet Leavitt." He said that because her husband, Ken Leavitt, she and Kenny met at Yale Law School. Kenny was coming out here for something, so he wanted Janet to want to come to Oklahoma. She grew up in Chicago. I said, "Sure, I'll interview her," and I did, and ended up hiring her. Let me make a comment here about law clerks, because that's one of the really fun parts of this job, is we get to hire these fabulous young up-and-coming lawyers who are really smart as our law clerks and get to work with them for a year.
And what a great experience you're giving them.
Yeah, but it's a two-way street.
You're learning from them?
I'm learning from them. They come from all over. I like people. You know, I usually hire people from all over the place.
And you didn't have that experience clerking for anybody?
No. I had the offer on, I think it was the Massachusetts Supreme Court. And then I decided I didn't want to do that.
So, as I said, today is December 5th, 2019, and the nation is grappling with impeachment hearings regarding President Donald Trump. And the issue is, was there a quid pro quo involving Ukraine and the president? Did he withhold aid, forcing the Ukrainian president to investigate President Trump's political rival, Vice President Joe Biden, and his son Hunter? I don't know if you got to watch any of it yesterday, but it was kind of like we had a constitutional law class.
I got to hear some of it.
You got to hear some of it?
I got to hear some of it.
3 law professors testified, some by the Democrats, another was tapped by the Republicans. I think they all agreed there's reason for impeachment, but the one Republican thought we were moving too fast.
That was interesting. And part of that's political. I mean, I kind of think they're moving too fast, to the extent there are court cases pending about getting witnesses in who say that we're not going to be a witness because the president doesn't want us to and we're working for the president. People who know a lot about what went on haven't testified as a result of that. So in that sense, it would be nice if the process were longer. Part of the problem is politics. The Iowa presidential election's coming up. There are some senators who are in it. So there's reasons to speed it up and not have it go into the election year. They're all political questions. But the constitutional issues are fascinating.
Right.
Well, I think a lot of people don't understand that impeachment by the House is simply a charging process, like a prosecutor charging somebody with a crime. And then it has to be tried by a court if it's a prosecuted case, or in this case, trial by the Senate. So this stage of the process is simply saying there is enough evidence to charge him with this.
Right. And that follows him the rest of his life.
Yeah. But he's entitled to defend himself.
Right.
So far, he's not chosen to do that.
Have judges in Oklahoma or in the Tenth Circuit been impeached?
No. It's a very seldom used process.
But it is used against judges, too, not just presidents.
Yeah. We have judicial misconduct system, and we are governed by that. We are not permitted to talk publicly about politics, for example, which is one of the things Brett Kavanaugh did. Probably saw his rant about when he was up for being a justice. He came from the D.C. Circuit, and there were 70 judicial misconduct complaints filed in the D.C. Circuit against him for his conduct. The next day, he was confirmed by the Senate and went on the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court does not have these rules that we have because this is a tripartite government. They were an equal branch. Congress can't pass a law governing the Supreme Court. Congress passed the judicial misconduct system governing us because we're lower than the Supreme Court. So what happened was he was no longer on the D.C. Circuit. So all 70 judicial misconduct complaints were sent to the Chief Justice, Roberts. The Chief Justice sent them all to the chief of our circuit, Tim Timkovich, who's in Denver, to decide. And the case is moot. I had judicial misconduct complaints against judges in this circuit who committed judicial misconduct. And when you decide that, one of the options is to resign, which moots the case. There have been judges that did that. So I knew it was moot. He was no longer on the court. So I said to Tim when I saw him, I said, "Are you just going to declare this moot?" He said, "No." He said, "I think the public needs to understand there needs to be a process beyond that." What that means is if there's a judicial misconduct complaint against a federal judge, when I was chief, you have to give the judge a right to respond. And if you think it's totally clear, I could have entered an order declaring that. But if there's fact questions, then you convene the Judicial Council of the Tenth Circuit, which consists of 5 circuit judges and 4 district judges, as I recall, and they decide it. There can actually be a hearing before it. So what our chief did was send that judicial misconduct complaint to those 9 judges, and they wrote a published opinion. It's what Tim wanted. He wanted a published opinion that would be out there explaining exactly why this case was moved, why nothing could be done about his judicial misconduct. He did that very effectively by just explaining how the system worked, in the course of which he said, Judge Kavanaugh, as a sitting circuit judge on the D.C. Circuit, committed judicial misconduct under our rules when he sat there and ranted about this was all the Democrats' fault, because we're not supposed to talk politics. The opinion clearly said, and you can find it, that that was judicial misconduct, but then explained why nothing could be done because he was no longer a circuit court judge. He was on the Supreme Court. Fascinating, huh?
Mm-hmm. What other kind of complaints would it have been? You said 70 complaints.
Oh, it's just anybody, any lawyer, anybody can file a judicial misconduct complaint. So just a bunch of people did it.
Okay. So these are lifetime appointments. How old is the longest serving judge?
Bill Holloway was 90. McWilliams was older than that. Bill Holloway was a federal judge in Oklahoma City. I said we can quit or we can work as long as our brains are working. And there is a process if a judge gets dementia or anything, so they're not really capable. There's an internal process for handling that. The judge does not stay.
How long do you think you will continue to
My
do
husband says, I will die with a brief in my hand. I don't know. I mean, it's such a fabulous, fascinating job. I'm only doing 25%, and it's only 25% of the orally argued cases. And there's a bunch of our cases that are not orally argued, like all this pro se stuff. I don't do that anymore. I just do cases that are orally argued. 25% of that, and our caseload has gone down. We have as many cases in this circuit now with 12 judges as we had in 1980 with 8 judges. Our filings have gone way down, in part because we have a really great mediation program in this circuit, which was started with the idea of Judge Gorsuch and Judge Timkovich a number of years ago. They said, it's very important. We've got all these cases. Our caseload was growing a lot. We need to train the federal district judges to deal more and to get more into court mediation. And so they set up a program where we had speakers come in and all the federal judges were talked to about how much better it would be to have some of these cases mediated. And I guess that worked because when I asked our chief, Timkovich, how come our cases have gone down so much, he said, good mediation program. And he said, maybe they're afraid of you guys. I don't know. And they just settled. But our caseload has done a lot.
You were a trailblazer for women on the court. Few women grads in 65. First woman in various roles. What is your message to women who are planning to go into the world of law?
You have a lot easier time than I did because there are now a lot of women lawyers. But I guess my message includes don't give up your family life, because I had 4 children over time. I worked part-time. I worked 4 days a week for a number of years when I was a lawyer. I took off 6 months. There was no maternity leave back then. I just took off. But firm I worked for was always fine with that. It didn't really know what to do with me, so I just sort of created rules as I went along. It is very possible to have a family life and practice law. One of the things I say is there should be more women starting their own firms, because then they would have control over that. But the system is much better than it used to be. And a lot of firms have maternity leave. If they don't, you can take 3 months off without pay under federal law now. So having a balanced life is great.
Young women are still looking to strong role models like yourself, and it's got to encourage them. Look what she did. I can do this. I can be strong. I can be smart and all that. You have no idea how many women you've inspired. And all the interns that came through.
Yeah.
And they weren't all women. I mean, they were men and women.
Big mix.
Right.
Of course, it affects the guys, too, to work for a woman.
How's that?
Well, they can see that women are competent. One of the things I always tell my law clerks was the business about balance. It's not a great thing that big law firms, you go to work in New York and you work how many hour days. One thing great about ending up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, lawyers here tended to be more sane about that. I didn't work on weekends. I'm very efficient. I brought my lunch. I worked through lunch hour. I found out early on that if you go in on Saturday, they're yakking most of the time anyway and not getting a lot of work done. So I was able to do what I did just by bringing my lunch and working when I was at work and not working at home. Or if I had to take work home, I love to cook, so I always cooked dinner. That was a big balance for me between the job and home. And then if I had stuff to do, get the kids in bed and do it after that.
Women have it more difficult in that area, don't they, than the men?
Well, because we have the babies.
Yeah. We're in your office here in the federal building. Is this where you've always been?
Yes, but originally I was in some hole in the wall downstairs until I got this space. But I've been here a long time.
How many years do you think you've been in this office?
Probably since 1980, 81. I can't remember. It was a long process because you're dealing with the government to get stuff done.
I'm fascinated by that round desk you have there. Is there a story behind it?
Yes. I saw it and I loved it. I saw it somewhere and I just wanted it, and it cost more than the government was going to spend. I had an allowance, and so we paid for the rest of it. I said, I just won't get a new car because I love this desk. And I said, and when we retire, I can take it home. It's got 2 sides.
Yeah.
And we can work at it. Of course, that's never happened because I haven't retired totally.
How would you like to be remembered?
As a good judge and a good mom and a good wife. How's that?
Yeah.
All of which are very important to me.
It is very good.
And a good grandmother.
Yes.
Nothing like those grandkids.
How many grandchildren do you have?
11. And only 3 of them are boys. So, as I say, we're going to eventually take over.
Another judge that I've interviewed is Judge Joe Morris.
He was a great guy.
Still alive at 90-some. And I'm trying to think of the federal judge in Oklahoma City. I've interviewed him. He's so funny, so humorous.
Lee West.
Lee West.
Yeah. He was one of the 4 names given to President Carter. He was one of the 4 on the list that the nominating commission sent to the president. I was really worried about him because he was in Washington, D.C. for a time, and he'd been golfing with the lawyer in the Justice Department who was in charge of the process. So I thought, but Carter appointed him to the federal bench after that. But he applied for the Tenth Circuit position.
Well, thank you, Judge, or I've come to call you Stephanie.
Yeah.
I enjoyed this very much. A non-lawyer trying to make his way through an interview with you. You made it very easy. So I'm hoping that young people who listen to this will learn a lot from what you've just said. And I thank you very much.
Happy to do it.
This oral history presentation is made possible through the support of our generous foundation funders. We encourage you to join them by making your donation, which will allow us to record future stories. Students, teachers, and librarians are using this website for research. And the general public is listening every day to these great Oklahomans share their life experience. Thank you for your support as we preserve Oklahoma's legacy one voice at a time on voicesofoklahoma.com.